welcome to the Beach Catholic Podcast. My name is Sean. I'm your host for today's podcast episode. And we are here with, as always, here joined by Father Brian Barr. Father Brian, how are you doing today?
Good, Sean. How are you?
I'm doing good. For all of you faithful listeners out there, you may notice that our co-host Lorenz is not with us today. He just had his third child, which is kind of wild, actually. But thank God his kids and his wife are all healthy amid, the coronavirus and everything else that's been going on. But he just had his third beautiful daughter. So we all wish him the best and offer prayers for health and well-being for all of them coming out of all this.
We got to pray. Probably should say a special prayer for Lorenz. He's got a house of 4 women now. Fans of all. Congratulations, Lorenz.
No comment. I grew up in a house of all boys except for my mom, so I know she had a rough time, but she enjoyed it at the end of the day. So, real quick before we get started, Father Brian, I know last night you guys had the event at the church. You did some outdoor adoration, right?
We did. Yeah, we did. It was actually it was a really nice night. It's kind of the first. It was the first thing that we've really done public prayer since the shutdown, which was on St. Patrick's Day. That was the first. St. Patrick's Day was the first, live stream mass when the churches were closed. I guess the weekend before was when it was. I guess that was the weekend before. I guess. Oh yeah, it was when the church sort of said you didn't have to come out to mass. The obligation was lifted, but it wasn't actually shut down at that point. So since on the 17th of March, that was the first one, and we really haven't had anything really public since. So we got the green light to at least be together outside, distanced appropriately. So it was great. I think we had about 95 people who came out, and we just kind of sat them. We put these little kind of spray painted white crosses in the parking lot with the right distance, and it was cool. It was really just it was just great to see people I haven't seen in months now, and I just this sort of collective feeling of like it's just so nice to kind of be back together as church. This way anyway. So yeah, great night.
It's funny you mentioned that weekend before St. Patrick's Day. I remember that vividly because it's the last time that I was sitting inside of a restaurant till today. But hopefully we're able to get back together in the churches for mass. But it's awesome that the community at St. Mary's and you were offering that kind of outdoor adoration. And just for people to be able to see each other and connect again.
Good stuff.
So let's get into today's conversation. And, I think it goes without saying that the whole country, in light of some of the recent events that have gone on, specifically with George Floyd, he died because he was essentially assaulted by a police officer while he was being taken under custody. He was held with a knee over his neck for about 8.5-9 minutes and ended up dying as a result. And in the wake of that, there's been just a whole lot of social unrest, everything from peaceful protests and calls for justice to riots and fires and senseless beatings in the street, kind of across the whole spectrum. And I know, myself being a millennial, I'm on social media and I just see a whole lot of social media stuff going on about it. So we wanted to take the time now to, not give our 2 cents necessarily, but maybe just give a perspective on how we can see this in light of the church and in light of Christ. So, Father Brian, I'm going to pass it to you. I know you have a little bit to say about it to start.
Yeah, obviously it's terrible. And, I think it's, in some respects, it's not elements of this, I guess, are very complicated questions of race and, systemic historical discrimination, the history of our country in a lot of respects. So it's not, there's certainly quick fix responses is arrogant and a waste of time. So I don't mean to sort of like present silver bullets, just sort of cleaning this thing up. It is complicated. However, I mean, aren't there elements of this horrible story that are kind of simple? Like everybody says what that cop did was appalling. There's no debate there. It's not like there are groups of people saying, no, that was okay and that was justifiable. Like there's no conflict there. And an awful lot of people are saying torching police cars and looting drugstores is horrible. And there's not a lot of debate there. Now, there are more than a few people that are looting, and doing destructive stuff. And there are more than a few people that are racist. But most aren't. Like, most aren't in line with that police officer behavior and attitude. And most aren't okay with trashing cities and neighborhoods. So I don't know, like, is there just some value to say, okay, and I don't want to diminish division, but is there more unity than we might think? I mean, we can almost become like addicted to watching these images, the news, and just like, it is horrifying. Like, some, depending on who you are, you want to jump through the screen for different reasons, but like you're kind of make a combination of like enraged and discouraged at the same time. But is there more? Are we more together than some people might say? I guess that's a question or something to throw out. And that's not to say, so maybe it's not as bad as we think. I mean, it's horrible. It's horrible. This thing is going on a week, and what initiated was even more horrible, the death of this innocent man. But just a question of division and distance. Like, I'm not so sure. I don't know if it's as bad as we've convinced ourselves. When I was in college, when I was in high school, I went to a Holy Cross High School in Queens, New York City. Right down the block, about a mile away, was another Catholic high school, St. Francis Prep. So two Catholic high schools very close to each other. We hated each other. Like, it was just this natural rivalry. And they were both pretty good sports, had pretty good sports programs. So whenever Holy Cross played Prep, it was just always an intensity that was more than typical. So if you if you were a Holy Cross kid and you were, taking the city bus, passing Prep, like, it was like you had nothing, you wouldn't even kind of look at Prep kids. And it was mutual. It was stupid high school stuff, but like, we didn't like them and they didn't like us. We were different. We were from here and they were from there. Anyway, and that's I'm probably describing every high school. Every high school's got a rivalry, right? A rival. But I remember a couple of years, fast forward a year or two, and I'm now in college. I was at a frat party, and it was my first couple of days in this school. I was new there. I had transferred, so I didn't really know almost anybody. And I'm at this frat party. I don't even know who I was with, but I guess it was other transfer students, but kind of not feeling like. Didn't really have a lot of friends at that point. These were all new people, and I'm walking toward the bathroom at this frat house, and I see a kid with a St. Francis Prep sweatshirt. So I said to him, said, did you go to prep? Is that in New York, in Queens? And he goes, yeah. I said, yeah, I went to Holy Cross. So we both kind of like looked at each other and smiled like, you know, I don't like you, you don't like me. Well, the opposite ended up happening. I asked him where he lived, and we ended up knowing a few mutual people. And anyway, it was ironic. Like 6 months before, when I was in high school, I would have walked across, you know, I would have not engaged this guy because he was from this school, different place. Now in a different setting, that almost became a source of us being connected. Like if it wasn't for this noticing this aspect of who he was, which was different from me, I never would have talked to this guy. I wouldn't have had the conversation. So it's just like, I don't know, like the things that divide us, the things that we kind of highlight as differences, are they often overdone and overblown? And we, because of where we're from or what we look like or our accents or our last name, it's like this. It's like the sweatshirt. Does the sweatshirt become this symbol of I'm different from you, or is it? You know, it's funny. It was like once we, you know, in this Catholic world, we were enemies. These two Catholic high schools. Once you take these two Catholic high school kids, you put them in a larger context where everybody isn't Catholic. Now we're kind of like related to each other. You know, it's just what we do with our differences, I think, is really important. Kind of like, and now broaden it way beyond high school rivalries, like our common humanity.
Again, like this is, like you said, this is such a complex thing, and race in general, it's, you know, it almost seems lighthearted to compare it to a high school rivalry, but at the same time, what you're saying is 100% right. Like, you may see yourself on a different team, but at the end of the day, we are on the same team. We're kind of made up of the same thing, and we're fighting for the same stuff. But and again, it's not to sugarcoat. I think, you know, a lot of the Black community in America definitely interprets and has experienced serious racism and serious, you know, what could be called systemic racism from the communities that they're involved in. And meanwhile, at the same time, I think of St. Paul, right? He says, though you are many parts, you are one body. And in that body is Christ. So what do you think of that, Father Brian? The whole idea of, you know, you may be made up of different things and have different functions and serve different purposes, but at the end of the day, it's all one body.
Well, I mean, it's just, you know, I may have mentioned this before. I say I help out as a jail, county jail here in East Meadow, Nassau County, and I'm not the chaplain there, but I go over maybe every 5 or 6 weeks, and I'll say mass on a Saturday morning. I'll say two masses, men's group of men and a group of women inmates. And it's just always a kind of almost have this similar experience pretty much every time I go. Like, you walk into this place, you're in this jail, it's a horrible place, and you're waiting, these inmates come in and you're looking at them and they're like kind of like rough looking, and they look sort of beat up and banged up. You listen to some of them talk and you're like, man, like they very just come from clearly like from sort of tough backgrounds. But then you start talking to them. And if you start preaching to them in a certain way, the women react this way more than the guys, but the guys do too in their own guy sort of way. Like if I start to say something in a homily about your children, like Some of them have kids. Some of these women have their moms, and or I'll say something about parents. Your relationship. If you're talking to the guys, I'll make some reference to a relationship to your father, and maybe like a father who didn't do a good job, a dad who was very absent, and you can just see like it's like everything in their eyes, like they just you just know you're tapping into something. Like everybody's got a mom and a dad, and I'm not saying everybody's got a good experience of that, but everybody comes from a family. And I guess my point is, it's like anyway. So when you start to tap into some of that stuff, like these people that walked into this little gross little prison chapel 15 minutes before, like who were kind of intimidating looking and very different from me and the life family I grew up in and all that. Like the distance kind of lessens. And that's really my point. Like the distance. I remember this was a number of years ago. I was a pretty young priest at the time, same prison, same jail, and I was helping out. I went in the parking lot, walking in. This woman's walking toward me, looking like she's going to her car. She sees me dressed as a priest, stops me, says, "Am I going in?" I said, "Yeah." She starts to cry. She says, "Could I see her son? He had just been sentenced or something. He was going to jail, going upstate for a longer time, and it was bad. And he was very down. He was very discouraged. And I remember being struck by the fact that she didn't defend him. She didn't say he was innocent or anything like that. She didn't say he was guilty, but it's kind of implied. It wasn't like this was unfair or unjust. It was her son. And, everybody's somebody's son or daughter. Everybody is sort of like this common, and again, we don't all come from the same places and healthy places. But I think it's what Paul was, I think it's like, that's what, in the parking lot. So I said, yeah, I'll totally try and see him, the son. And then she said, I can't stop seeing him. She said that his friends were sort of checking out. They were no longer visiting, and he was just increasingly isolated. And she looked at me like she was almost like she was apologizing, like, I'm gonna keep seeing him. And I was like, of course you're gonna keep, like, he's your son. Just like a lot of the differences and the distances that do exist between people and cultures, and in some respects race, I guess. I think if you cut away a lot of it, it's like, no, it's all the same. Like we are all connected here. And hey, my life may look very different than yours, but we come from the same place. Yeah, we come from the same place. So we're all cousins. Like we're all related. And that kind of may sound a little pie in the sky, and but it is what Paul was talking about. And I think it's like our goal is to, and it's very hard. I mean, as a white guy who grew up in a middle-class home, and my father was a New York City fireman, and lots of people in my life were cops and civil servant lives. Like, I see people destroying some innocent person's store. People who were just coming out of the mess of this virus, financial struggles, and now like this thing is done. Like it's so easy for me to be enraged by that. And again, like that is enraging. It's objectively unacceptable. But if I'm also, I never experienced discrimination. I never really been in a significant minority dynamic where I'm the minority. So I don't know. I don't know what that's like and what that feels like. I think in terms of faith today, I think I feel more and more like I'm a minority in terms of my faith. I think, we've talked before about campus, your experience at working as a campus minister, being a student involved in campus ministry, college campus today. If you're a Catholic kid and on most campuses, man, you're a minority, and you do feel sort of that, whatever that thing is, where you're different and you're looked at different. But bottom line is, it's very different than racial discrimination. And anyway, kind of rambling, but I think Paul's right, and I think that's where we've got to go. Doesn't some of this seem like you're watching this, and don't you sort of at points say, how is this ever going to get fixed? How is this ever going to get better?
Yeah.
The people who had their, whatever, both sides, who have been so hurt, who were so innocent, and who were treated in such unjustified ways, how are they ever going to get past that hurt? And it doesn't the answer really become like a radical embrace in Christ?
Well, I think one of the, I was talking with some of my friends about it, many of whom, don't necessarily practice their faith, if they have any faith at all. But one of the things I said was, as somebody who believes in Christ and who's a Christian, I know this world is never going to be perfect because it's broken. It's broken by sin and by the evil that dwells here. And, Jesus came so that we could see that there was another way. And it's funny, I'm in the same boat. I'm a mid-20s white guy who never was alive during the 60s for race riots or the LA riots in the 90s. I think it was the 90s, right? So, those kinds of things weren't big significant factors in my life. And, you bring up the campus ministry thing. I think there's a degree of truth to that because as a student and as a professional campus minister, I saw how it felt to not be in the majority with how the group around you was thinking or acting. And I'm not equating that with racism or being a different skin tone, like you said, but, if somebody made a remark against my faith, which is, or against God, who is that's the thing that I hold most dear in my life. Yeah, there was a part of me that reacted violently internally. It was, I would get very angry. I would get very frustrated. And I try to look at what's going on now in those kinds of lenses, to try to not rationalize or justify what's going on as far as the rioting goes, but try to, just try to empathize a little bit with, the emotions that are going on. And, unfortunately, I think that they are being mismanaged, but at the same time, there's just been, a lot to stir them up. When I think of that St. Paul line, the many parts, one body, I think about like a literal body, right? And if I'm a body part or even like a cell in a body, I do my job and I do my role and serve my purpose. But at the same time, I'm dependent on all of the other cells and body parts doing their job and serving their purpose so that the body can operate fully, as it's supposed to. And part of me thinks kind of what you're saying is like, many of us saw that video of Derek Chauvin, the police officer, putting his knee on George Floyd's neck. And all of us reacted very viscerally and sadly to it because I think like you're saying, we can identify with the humanity there. And we're almost see it like, if you're honest with yourself, maybe you're saying you feel like you're losing a part of yourself as that's happening, and not for nothing, but seeing the police officer do it was extremely angering because you're like, that's not how a part of this body is supposed to be working.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's almost like a cancer got in and is causing the body to operate wrongly. But at the end of the day, that's really what evil is. And that's really what, unfortunately, these kind of evil ideological mindsets can get people into, if that's really what was stirring it up. But I mean, to me, that's always what that line has led me to. And I think in light of all this, it's like, if you look at another person, you should see them as no less than an extension of yourself. And I think of C.S. Lewis in his essay, The Weight of Glory. He says, next to the Blessed Sacrament, your neighbor is the most holy object you're going to encounter in this world, because it's just like you. It's a human being that was willed into existence through the love of God, whom Jesus came to earth and died on a cross for, and then rose again so that they could have salvation. It's like, I know that's true for me, and that's why I'm faithful. But if it's true for me, it's true for every other single person on this planet. And regardless of skin color or anything else, you need to respect that. And you need to, not only respect that, but like love that other person.
When you meet people, we all do encounter people who live that. I mean, probably not a lot, but like you do meet people who are just different. Like that's not what you just said about our connectedness and our the relationship, just our human connectedness. Like, I can think of a couple of people in my life who really do act that way. Like, they've got this piece about them, kind of a unique kind of, I don't know, they're like less guarded. They're, I guess, less defensive. And you see it. I mean, that's maybe the way the saints were, or certainly some saints. So it's possible. It's possible. And, is that, finding ways of leading us toward that. I remember reading this. It was an article. It was kind of like an editorial, I guess, and I think it was the New York Post a couple of years ago. And there's a story about this, I think it was like a mother and their son or daughter, and they were flying on a plane, and they had their dog with them. And they had the dog in a carrier, like a pet carrier thing. So it was, they were going to put the dog under the seat for the flight. And the flight attendant came up and said, "Yeah, that's no good. You, whatever, it's too big or something like that." And they said, "Well, no, we always do this." In fact, I think they were coming back from somewhere. So it was like, this is how we did it on the first leg of this trip. And then she was like, "You can't do it. You got to put the dog up above in the luggage thing." And they were kind of arguing about this, and they find, or mildly, they protested it, but they ultimately said, like, okay. So they put the dog up top, and they said the plane took off, and you could hear the dog barking, and there was turbulence, so they weren't allowed to get out of their seat. And then eventually the barking stopped, and the dog died. The dog died, and it was like a horrible story. But the point of it was, of this writer was, why did nobody do anything? Like, it was everybody, probably not everybody on the plane, but everybody in that area, front rows, back rows, heard this. First of all, they heard the dog barking, and then they heard the dog stop barking. But it was this like, everybody knew this was nuts. Everybody knew this wasn't right. They didn't do anything. And the point was like, it was actually about like authority and how we, as a society, we are too respectful of authority, and it's horrible, horrible things historically can happen when you don't stand up to an unjust authority figure. Like this flight attendant was given way more power than he or she warranted. And this very sad little story happened. Like, those three, was it the three other police officers in Minneapolis? Like, you see almost as much of them in that video as you do the poor man who died and the guy who killed him. Like, how did they not do something? I mean, this is even more bold. How did somebody who was witness, the guy whoever was taking the picture, filming it, like the phone? Can you imagine if the person filming it stopped and said, "Hey," like walked over to the cop or tried to make their way to the cop to push the cop off the guy? Like, he would have been tackled probably by the other cops and probably gotten knocked around. That guy would probably be alive today, though. Like that's really bold, pushing the authority of a police officer out of the way. But like, how did they allow that to happen? I mean, and how did people allow Nazi Germany to happen? And
Yeah, I was about to bring that up. I know. I think of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He wrote that book, The Gulag Archipelago.
Yeah.
Decades in the gulags in Stalinist Russia.
Yep.
And he writes in it that the line between good and evil is a thin one, and it crosses every human heart.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has that decision to make, whether you're going to be complicit in evil when it's happening around you, or if you're going to potentially sacrifice the good of yourself in order to stop the evil from happening.
That's right.
But at the end of the day, that's what love is in the life of Christianity. It's sacrificing what's good for you so that what's actually good with the capital G can happen.
Totally. And it's not, it's not like you wait to this almost once in a lifetime moment like the Minneapolis story before you're tested. I mean, you get tested when you are in third grade and there's a kid on the school bus who's being made fun of. And nobody's doing anything or worse, probably middle school or high school, when it gets, the level of cruelty can become really intense. And it's terrible, it's wrong. You're not doing it, maybe you're not inflicting the cruelty on the kid, but you're letting it happen. I mean, Minneapolis is just an appalling version of that. So the more we, I think the more we're challenged, the more kids are taught, like, hey, you can't hang out in the bleachers of life when somebody is when there's injustice. I mean, it's a question of justice and injustice, and kind of just I was reading for the Holy Hour last night. I was reading a letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King. I mean, it is so awesome. It's kind of long. It's about 7 or 8 typed pages, small print. And he wrote this letter in the jail in Birmingham. And it's worth Googling and printing and reading it and even praying with it and about it, because it's just he's so articulate. He's referencing Thomas Aquinas and how we should respond to unjust laws. What's our obligation? And I just think like this amazing combination of, like, he was writing the letter, if I got this right, it was like these Southern Christian pastors. They were part of this organization, and they were totally punting on the situation. Like the segregation situation continued to be terrible, and the way protesters were being treated was horrible. Dogs and the fire hoses and all that. And these Protestant Christian pastors who were in theory supporting an end to segregation and the need for civil rights reform, just that we got to go slower and we need to be patient. And he kind of picks it apart. And he's like, well, sometimes you can't be patient, and sometimes you just have to act. And again, it was always nonviolent. I mean, I suspect he's rolling over in his grave because this is people keep saying, what's the name of the man who died in Minneapolis?
George Floyd.
His family and his people are saying this is just such a dishonor to him and the way he lived. Poor Martin Luther King must be saying, God, this was not what I, don't give me credit for this. Now he'd also probably be maybe almost equally saddened by the fact that 60 years later, what he tried to do hasn't in a lot of ways been fulfilled. But anyway, it was just it's an incredible, I don't claim to know that much about King, but you can't not be inspired. It's like trying to be reasonable, trying to be respectful of law, but at the same time saying, we're not going to kind of be made fools of endlessly. Anyway, it's great stuff.
I'm kind of out of that. I think it's natural as, you and I and probably everybody, and especially people who aren't, Black, are reflecting on all of this and trying to think of what does it mean for me and what does it mean for my view of the world and my little sphere of influence in the world. And I've spent the last couple of days just trying to think of that question exactly, like what should I be doing? I'm a firm believer that, St. James said in his letter, faith without works is dead. And I know that, God is love and he is perfect love. And he could force us all to act in a perfectly loving way if he wanted us to. But he doesn't do that because he loves us so much. And he leaves it up to us. He gives us his word in the scripture, and he gave us Jesus, his son, and he gives us the church, and he talks to us in our own hearts, and he gives us all these tools to steer us toward him. But ultimately, it's up to us to actually take that, pray with it, and then act upon it. And it's funny you mentioned, Martin Luther King. I've seen a lot of the, on social media and different things like that. The quote that he had said once was, "Rioting is the language of the unheard." But I can't imagine that he would.
What was that? Rioting.
Rioting.
Oh, rioting. Rioting is the wow. I never heard that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's it. And
it's cool. I mean,
I hear it, and I think he's 100% right, because it is. It's coming from a place of deep emotional hurt.
Yep.
Not being listened to, and while I can't imagine that Martin Luther King would be condoning what's going on right now, because he was nonviolent in all of his major protesting, but at the same time, I hear that and I think, well, what can I do? Maybe it's as simple as making yourself available to listen when this kind of stuff happens, and then beyond that, kind of like you were saying, like not being afraid to step in when you see injustice happening. If you do see injustice happening, not being afraid to vocalize that.
That's an amazing quote. I think with this whole situation, like, which just everybody seems so quick to, like, you categorize a person. So if you're expressing like that quote, like that's a challenging. It's like you hold me, you tie up my hands and legs and prevent me from being free. I'm going to get really angry at you, and if the only way I can get your attention or attention is to do something destructive, like, it's still not the way to go, but like to be able to say like, yeah, but okay, you can't do that, but that doesn't mean you're now just this thug. Like, it doesn't mean you're just, and I do think, by the way, there's a bunch of 16-year-old thugs that are out there trashing cities who aren't struggling with any of this. I think they're just, sort of this.
Listen, when you see the white millennial running out of the Target with a box of Legos, that's when
right.
You're just being a little selfish and opportunistic with the experience.
Completely. But maybe another level of it, where it's, and it's like, so if you start to express a little bit of sympathy, like that King quote, like, yeah, maybe, when if you oppress me to a certain point, I'm going to become a really angry, kind of nasty guy because you've taken away my freedom, and that expresses itself in unpleasant ways. Like, to kind of like entertain that possibility does not mean you hate cops. Doesn't, like, it's like, no, I love police and I respect them, but maybe there's something to be said on this side, and the reverse, to be defensive of order and law and police. Like, don't tell me I'm a racist because I'm defending people in uniform. Like, it's not either or. I mentioned this today at Mass. The gospel was the gospel where, they're trying the Jewish authorities are trying to get Jesus once again sort of in trouble, and they present often they do like these sort of like unwinnable scenarios where no matter what he says, he's going to alienate somebody. So they give him the coin, which has the image of Caesar on it. Should we pay taxes to Caesar? So, if he says, yeah, pay taxes to Caesar, that means he's going to alienate the Jewish people who saw him as an oppressor. If he says, no, don't pay the taxes, well, then you're going to alienate, the government. So kind of like, no matter what he says, he's gonna aggravate certain people. Anyway, he kind of responds in this kind of puzzling way, but trips them up, and it's ultimately like, hey, some things we do for Caesar and some things we do for God, and even that, he could talk forever about that, quite exactly what he means. But I was saying how at Mass, how this weekend on one of the Sunday morning talk shows, there were these two guys being interviewed together. One was a retired Chicago police officer, and the other was a civil rights attorney. So they were coming from two different worlds and generally defending where they came from. So they were kind of, at points, sparring, but it was never like crazy, horrible attacks, but they were explaining where they're coming from and why these respective groups do what they do and so on. But then at the end, this is kind of my point, and I was impressed with them. The police officer said something like, my grandfather, my father, a bunch of uncles, and a bunch of cousins were all cops. Like, I come from this police world, and I don't apologize for it, and I'm grateful for it, and it's shaped my worldview. And I love being a police officer. But we're far from perfect, and you don't have to look far to see the imperfection. And we have an obligation to fix what's broken and to maybe probe areas about ourselves that we don't want to. And then the civil rights attorney goes, I think he said, my grandfather's brother, my great uncle, would that be? And his wife marched with Martin Luther King, 60 years ago, whatever it was, and 50 something years ago. And the same, like, kind of the same thing, like, this is who I am and where we come from. And I'm proud of kind of like my family's history. And, but he was like, torching police cars is never okay, and stealing flat screen TVs that's never Yeah, now, rioting is the language of the unheard, but like stealing TVs is just not legit. And what I liked about what both these guys said was, I'm not gonna deny who I am and where I'm from, but because maybe I love where I'm from and who I am, I'm able to kind of critique it. And I just thought, I was like, man, is that almost what like that gospel was? You got like, were they both implicitly saying there's a higher truth than the Chicago Police Department, and there's a higher truth than the NAACP. They're true and they're important, but there's something more important, and it's God's law. It's not Caesar's, it's God's law, and it's God. It's Jesus. It's Jesus's way and His truth in His life. And they didn't say any of that, but I think implicitly they were. And is that, I don't know, maybe back to where we began, like this gross, sad chapter in our history most recently, because that is it, like sort of like, okay, what's the highest truth here? Like, and hey, you and I would say, well, whatever He said, we should do. Like whatever Jesus, if the most we can understand how Jesus would respond, that's what we should do, and that will, in time, lead to reconciliation, greater mercy, and justice on both ends. So it's like, at the end of the day, He's the prescription. He's the remedy.
Yeah, absolutely. With the whole thing about if you support cops, you're racist. If you support, Black Lives Matter, for example, it means you hate cops, or across the board, back and forth. And I think maybe it's just because everything is so polarized politically and socioeconomically and everything. Like, if you're over there, that means you can't be over here.
Yep.
But then in Catholicism, it's very much more of a both and than an either or take on things. Our faith is ancient, and yet every day it springs new. Like it's full of paradox, and part of that is the cliche: hate the sin, love the sinner. And it's like, yeah, I don't like that thing that person's doing, but at the core, I know that person is a child of God, just like I am, even if they're not acting like it. And I know that I also sin, even though I'm a child of God. And both of us deserve better and should strive for better, but that doesn't mean that we come down on them. And all that's just an example. You don't need to pick a side per se. There are, like you mentioned before, there are times of gross injustice, like Nazi Germany, where it's like you're not going to be like, well, I kind of sympathize with them there.
Right.
And with this example of this police officer who ultimately killed George Floyd, you're not going to say, I kind of understand what he was doing there, because he was clearly in the wrong. But at the end of the day, there is a both and approach to this whole thing, where you can say, I want to support my Black brothers and sisters and make sure that they are being treated equally and are getting justice. And at the same time, I want to support normal, lawful order and in a just way, and make sure that there's no chaos going on and that there's no rioting going on. I think that those don't have to be exclusive arguments. You can kind of like ride the fence a little bit on that.
Yep. Well, you said, you referenced cliches. I mean, here's a real simple one, but like, it's easier said than done, but it's true. And it is easy to say it. It's not easy to do it, but we've got to try and do it.
Hey, Jesus said, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And none of us are ever going to be, but that doesn't mean we ignore what he said. We still have to try. I think with that, we can kind of wrap up the conversation, unless you have anything else you want to end with.
Yeah, that's good. Good conversation. Thanks.
Yeah. Hey, thank you. you have any final thoughts that you want to close with? I know for me, I would just say, emphasizing, again, if you're like me, if you're white and you've never encountered racism before, I'm not huge on, like, I'm not usually reflective on this kind of stuff, but I think that amid certain current events, I am thinking about, like, what can I do to empathize better with people who probably do experience this a lot more often than I do. Even if it's just next time I encounter somebody who's different from myself, can I make sure I am thinking about the way that they may be interpreting things in addition to how I interpret things, something simple like that. And I don't think that's asking too much of myself or of anybody. So certainly, I'm going to go forward and try to think more on that, but that's all I got.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I mean, I'm with you. And the hope is that, the real hope would be that we do become better. Wouldn't it be terrible if, these riots, you got to stop, I guess, eventually, right? And wouldn't it be terrible if nothing came of them? Like no good came of them. Like just the hope that, hey, we're a great country, and the challenge to be greater. Maybe humility, just a kind of a collectively, nationally, just to kind of say, like, yeah, in a spirit of humility, how do we, and with a sense of obligation, because I think God has blessed us, blessed our country, and I don't think we should apologize for that. I think doesn't mean we're better than other people, but we have been blessed in unique ways, and in so many ways historically, we've done great things with that blessing over our 200 plus years. But this is definitely this is a part of the picture, a part of the puzzle that continues to just not be what it should, so to make it right on both sides. And, both sides, if you want to say sides, because we all need to be challenged, legitimately challenged, and how good it would be if some of that happened as a result of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not too far off to say that each of us has this certain amount of power in our lives. And one cliche, with great power comes great responsibility. So we can take that and try to move forward and just try to be more responsible in general. I think
Spider-Man 2, was it?
Hey, yeah, it's Spider-Man.
All right.
Might as well get him involved too. All right. With that, we'll close up. I think we'll close out in prayer, but I would encourage everybody just pray a lot for prayer, for peace, for justice, for solidarity, and just so we can kind of see a common humanity here. Again, thank you for listening to the Beach Catholic Podcast or watching along. If you're watching on Facebook, you can catch this episode and all of our other recorded episodes at Facebook on the St. Mary of the Isle Facebook page. That's facebook.com/St. Mary of the Isle, or at beachcatholic.com/TV. Father Brian, do you want to close us out in prayer?
Sure. Let us pray. Lord, we ask you to bless our country, help us to live up to the ideals which we profess and believe in. Pray for people who have been victimized by bigotry, and we pray for those who defend us and protect us, law enforcement, for healing and for peace. We ask all of this through Christ our Lord.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your week, and we will see you next time.
See you later.